Hi, and welcome to Chapter 26, Rococo to Neoclassicism. All right, so we're going to be looking at primarily the 18th century, and this is going to be a century of tremendous change. We're going to begin the century, well, as a century of kings in Europe, these divine monarchs that we have seen. Everybody from Charles I to Louis XIV of France. And we're going to end the decade with the beginning of the revolutionary period. In between, we're going to see sort of the rise of science and technology because of a huge intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. We're also going to see political changes that will open up the world to democracy and also the foundation of some other political thoughts during this century. So, where do we begin? Well, we begin in many ways at the end of the Baroque. This is a palace in England that in many ways should remind you of Versailles, Louis XIV's palace, of course, that his country palace where he moved sort of his entire court out to so he could control them better. So this is very much in that style. Versailles inspired these kind of grandiose, sprawling palaces all throughout the European world among monarchs and the aristocracy. This was made for the Duke of Marlborough by the architects Sir John Vanbrugh and Nicholas Hawksmoor. But as you can see, with the large garden, with the multiple wings of the palace, it is very much in this Baroque style. But Louis XIV dies. He dies in the early part of the 1700s, and when he dies, all those members that he had taken out to Versailles and had very much tried to control because he was afraid of intrigue, move back into Paris, and they start building what we call hotels. Now, don't think of these as modern-day hotels where people rent rooms by the night, but instead these hotels would have been urban palaces, really, with multiple rooms. I mean, this is where our the modern designation for hotel gets its original name. But think of these as private residences. However, it would not have been uncommon for other members of the court or the aristocracy to be, staying with each other as they traveled throughout France. This period is also a period where women have a lot of influence. My dog just coughed in the background. Where women had a lot of influence in French society. Because what happens is this. These French women, and we're going to look at some of them here in a minute, these members of the French aristocracy really start to sort of take the reins of society. These women refer to themselves, and here's the spelling, as femmes savantes. Femmes savantes literally means learned women, and this is what they called themselves. And these were women who were highly educated. They were often spoke multiple languages. They were trained to play various musical instruments. They were sort of trained to be women of society, be women of the court, be women who could entertain, who could host parties, the women who were intellectual, who could carry on conversations about numerous topics, the events of the day, current news, politics, literature, fashion, whatever it is. And these femmes savantes would host parties that were called salons. And these salons became sort of the crux, the center of French society in this period that we call the Rococo. The Rococo is very much a period that is still sort of a bleed over of the Baroque. In fact, the term Rococo itself is a play on the word Baroque, Barococo. And in many ways, the styles and the fashions and the culture of this time are sort of get their cues from the Baroque, but it's a more playful version. So as you can see here, the fashion of the day is really extravagant with a this influence of really bright colors, of pastels, of this sort of extravagant clothing, which is very similar to Baroque clothing, but there's a playfulness and, a more stereotypical kind of femininity, I guess you could say, to this style. But these femme savants weren't women to be taken lightly, despite, sort of the clothing that you see here. Because these were incredibly intelligent women, and groups of really smart people, of intellectuals, gathered around these women and their salons. And this will lead to major changes in French and then later on European society because of these sort of great minds, these brilliant intellects from universities and the aristocracy, and coming together and exchanging ideas. So, what were these salons like? Well, you were expected to dress well. You were expected to be knowledgeable. This was a place to be seen. This was a place to show off your money and your fashion sense. But it was also a place to show off your intellect, your schooling, your knowledge of the world. You're not there just as a fashion plate, although that is certainly part of it. In many ways, these women are sort of like the Instagram influencers of their day. If Instagram influencers could speak multiple languages and play multiple instruments, and not that there aren't any that can't, but there is a sense of both fashion and sort of an intellectual quality to this culture of the Rococo and the salon. These femme savants, there were a handful of these very powerful, influential women. Probably the most powerful and influential was a woman named Julie de Lespinasse, but there was Madame de Pompadour, who was the mistress of the King of France. There was Maria Theresa, the Archduchess of Hungary, Catherine the Great of Russia, then of course the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. And here's two images of Julie de Lespinasse and Madame de Pompadour, and I think this gives you a good idea of what these femme savants, how they wanted to be seen. These were women of letters. They literally wrote letters to people, sort of expounding on their information, on their lives, and many of these letters were often published. Some of these women wrote memoirs. But these were very well-read, very educated women. As you can see in the central picture by Boucher of Madame du Pompadour, here's this woman sitting in a very typical kind of Rococo outfit, or sort of pale pastel greens and pinks in this very extravagant room. This is meant to show off her wealth and her power, but also her knowledge. You can see that she is sitting by a small writing desk, with a quill at the ready, sitting in the inkwell, and a book in her hand. So this is a woman of great intelligence, and that is really what she is trying to portray more than anything else here. Okay, so let's look at some of these salons in these hotels. This is by Germaine Bertrand. This is a Salon de la Princesse. This is, in very many ways, a kind of stereotypical salon room. You can see that we see very much a carryover with the Baroque, with the extravagance of the ornamentation, the use of gold leaf, this massive chandelier. But something you'll notice, and this is something we start to see at the end of the Baroque, but you'll see it into the Rococo, is a sort of a melding of the arts. Notice this entire room, in a way, is kind of a giant work of art. And there are paintings and sculptures in here, of course, but they are part of the decoration. So the paintings by Charles Joseph Notoir sort of blend into the ornamentation designed by the architect Bertrand, and then the sculpture by Lemoine also kind of feeds into everything. So it's like you're in sort of one giant sort of aesthetic experience, right? Where the furniture and imagine the way these people dress, in their extravagant clothing. So imagine people dressed like this walking around in these extravagant rooms. And it's really all about sort of presentation. It's all about sort of showing off your wealth and your power, as well as your knowledge and your intellect. But this is, the upper classes, guys. We would not be hanging out in one of these salons. Not as a guest, anyway. I might be, a guy serving, canapes or something. But this is a close-up. I was talking about, as you can see, this stuff just sort of blends in this really beautiful, flowing, aesthetic sort of way. This style eventually was exported out of Paris, out of France itself, and so this is a German example. But you can see, once again, something very similar to the Salon de Princesse that we just saw, where there's this integration of the arts. You don't see painting in this room, the Hall of Mirrors, which is located in Munich, but you do see sort of an integration of sculpture and the interior design. All right, so moving on to ecclesiastical or church architecture of the Rococo, let's take a look at Balthasar Neumann's Basilica Virgin, a pilgrimage church located in Bad Staffelstein, Germany. This is on the outside, a more typical kind of a Baroque church, very similar to maybe something done by Borromini, for example, with its undulating facade, its use of sort of elongated windows and oval forms that we have already seen before in the Baroque period. But if we look inside, we see something that is more typically Rococo. The color palette is lighter and airier, with the use of pinks and pale blues that are very common to the period. We also see that sort of more blending of the architectural elements with painting and the sculpture to create a more sort of entire kind of work of art, but it has almost a cloud-like quality to it. Everything, there's the best term I can sort of think of is kind of a fluffiness to it, right? Which is sort of typical of the Rococo period. If we look at one more structure, this is the Imperial Hall, the Kaiser Hall, located once again in Germany. This is the palace of the ruler of Germany by Neumann, and we can see once again that sort of integration of the different arts to create a one sort of gigantic structural work of art. I want to bring up something really quickly here. We're going to talk about the French Royal Academy of Painting in more detail in the next chapter. But I want you guys to understand that in Europe at this time, the French Academy of Painting was this incredibly influential government body that more or less controlled the production of painting. And if you wanted to be a working artist, if you wanted to have your work shown, it had to be shown annually, every year in what was called the Grand Salon. And if your work didn't meet the standards of the Academy of Painting, then you weren't allowed into the Grand Salon. Initially, the Grand Salon was held at Versailles, but then it was later moved to the Louvre. But I just want you to understand, so when I do talk about the Academy or the Academy of Painting, this was a huge deal. This was a very influential government institution, and this model in France was copied pretty much all over Europe. To one degree or the other, where other institutions, and we'll see even the United States had our own version of sort of an Academy of Painting. But these institutions really controlled the production of art and what kind of art was acceptable in any given country. So, with that in mind, let's talk about Antoine Watteau, one of the great, if not the great, Rococo artists. Um, and before I get into him, I want to talk about sort of a division in the art world between sort of two, and in the art academy, between two sort of schools of thought, the Poussinists and the Rubenists. And the Poussinists were followers of Poussin, who we discussed in the last chapter, whose art was very intellectual, whose art and very much was a sort of continuation of this concept of disegno from the Renaissance, this idea that art must have a purpose, it must have a moral, it must, disegno not only refers to good design, it sort of refers to sort of good intent, right? And the Poussinists said, as you can see in the quote, colors are allurements persuading the eye, but structure, something that is well drawn, that is well made, is what's important. Color is sort of special effects that don't really mean anything. On the other side, you had the Rubenists, who were sort of the equivalent of the idea of colorito from the Venetian Renaissance, and this idea that color and beauty and feeling and sensuality is sort of the most important thing. Color is supreme in a work of art. Watteau definitely falls into the realm of the Rubinist with his sort of airy brushstrokes, with his sort of softness to his forms, as you can see here, and most importantly, to this rich, deep color. This work is called L'Indifferent, the Indifferent One. It is a painting of a young French aristocrat. I've been watching too much Disney. A young French aristocrat. And it is, in many ways, the epitome of the Rococo style in painting. Watteau was sort of a superstar. He was loved by the Academy. He died very young of tuberculosis. He was in his early 30s when he passed away. But he left a huge legacy behind him. And this is pretty much a kind of typical Rococo piece. It is of an aristocrat. It is of somebody wealthy and powerful who is well dressed, who is wearing sort of the latest fashion, which is very typical of the Rococo period, with this young man in his fashionable silks and velvets. And he's indifferent. This is a man who is too rich to care, right? He is wealthy, he is powerful, he is sort of immune to the pressures of society. He doesn't have to live the daily grind. This is a man whose wealth protects him. And Watteau is fascinating because his artwork was images of the aristocracy, made for the aristocracy. And it wasn't critical of their lives, but it certainly shows the life of leisure and the indifference that these people could sort of exude. There's a knowingness, there's a psychological sharpness to Watteau's, or he knows that he's basically painting a bunch of rich kids, and he's okay with that, and he's making a lot of money from it, but he's aware of it. He's aware of that these are the wealthy and the powerful, and they don't have the same sort of worries and concerns that we do. This is his masterpiece. This is Return from Cythera, or sometimes called Embarkation of Cythera. Cythera is a Greek island of eternal youth. And this is a kind of a painting that became very popular in the Rococo and was invented by Watteau. It's called the Fête Galante. This is basically an outdoor party. And these were very popular among the aristocracy during the Rococo period. And it was often formed a way to dress up, an excuse to dress up. This is kind of, think of it as 18th century cosplay, right? Where these people would often dress up as ancient Greeks or Roman mythological figures, or they would dress up as people from plays in the theater. And so here we see this image of these young aristocrats who are either coming back or about to go to this island of Cythera. Of course, they're not actually going there. They're just pretending to go there because Cythera isn't a real place. But it's a place that is, this eternal youth, this sort of place of your eternal youth, is this sort of utopia that these aristocrats are longing for, this sort of perfect world that even they can't quite attain. And there's sort of an underlying sadness in a way underneath this painting, despite the fact that we're looking at a kind of a bunch of rich people, dressing up. There's this idea that this perfectness is always out of our reach, that it is always something that we can only play at, that but never quite attain. And there's a sense of yeah, sort of jubilance, and there's a sort of a party going on, but there's also an underlying melancholy here. Because ultimately, this is what we would call a memento, is a very subtle memento mori, a reminder of death, of our own mortality. And that's sort of what separates Watteau from some of the other Rococo artists that we're going to see, who focus mostly on the fashion and the glitz and the glamour and the opulence of this period. Watteau always goes a layer deeper, kind of like Rembrandt, getting into the heads of his people. This is almost sociology that we're sort of seeing in Watteau. This is another work by Watteau, a later work and a rather different work. This was made as a sign for an art dealer. It ultimately was never really quite used. Watteau sort of pushed this onto the art dealer. The art dealer didn't really want him to do this, so it only was kept, I think, in the gallery for something like 15 days, and it was eventually sold off. But here you see sort of the humor of Watteau. You see this is the image of the interior of the gallery, and for instance, you'll see this woman here who is turning her head away from this image of nude figures, showing sort of this sort of puritanical aversion to these nude bodies. In a way, he's kind of making fun a little bit of the aristocracy as well as celebrating them. Boucher is one of the great other artists of the Rococo period. His work is much more sort of flat-out extravagant than Watteau's was. He was the favorite painter of Madame de Pompadour, who we've already talked about, and he kind of becomes the big deal after Watteau's early death. But a lot of images of love, a lot of images of sort of a life of leisure are very common to these fête galante kinds of paintings. But to me, like, if you want to nail down the Rococo to one painting and say, all right, what represents the Rococo? To me, it's The Swing by Jean-Henri Fragonard. Fragonard is a student of Boucher, and he won the Prix du Rhum. What is the Prix du Rhum? Prix du Rhum was a contest set up in the time of Louis XIV through the Academy of Painting. And the winner of this contest would get to study in Rome, sort of the birthplace of, sort of seen as, art since the Renaissance, right? And would get to study in Rome and study around the art of the great master painters of the Renaissance and the Baroque period, and then also, of course, learn from the ancient Greek and Roman stuff scattered all around. So it was this very, it was this prize of sort of great honor and importance, and Fragonard wins it. So, this is his work, The Swing. It was originally painted for a nobleman and his mistress, but he didn't like it. He thought it was too frivolous. But to me, it's perfect. This is what the Rococo is about. We see a woman, a young aristocratic lady in a swing. In the background, we see this elderly man. I think originally this was supposed to be a bishop, but Fragonard kind of made him more just like a generic dude. But this old man is basically meant to be this sort of wholesome character, right? He's a sweet old man. He's going over to visit his neighbor, whether he's a bishop or not. He's going to visit his neighbor, this young aristocratic woman. And here, there's this very sweet moment is happening. The old man is pushing this young lady very innocently on a swing. Now, on the other side of the painting, we see a very different story. Because we see, first of all, this woman in her very extravagant, floofy, pink, Rococo dress with all the frills and crinolines and everything else going on, is swinging over a bush. And hiding in her bushes is a young man who is looking up. Of course, the old man on the other side is completely oblivious to what's going on, that this young lover of this woman is hiding in her bushes, and he is, well, if you can see where he's looking and the look on his face, she is showing him more than her footwear. In fact, she's playing with him. She is kicking off her shoe. It is flying through the air, and it will eventually land next to him. There's a playfulness, there's a silliness to this painting that is meant to be is meant to be fun. It's meant to be a little sexy. It's meant to be a little naughty. There's a visual pun going on here with him hiding in her shrubbery. So, this is meant to be a little playful and a little naughty. This is the life of leisure. This is the life of the rich and powerful aristocracy at the time. We see this kind of playfulness and eroticism and sort of sexiness even in the decorative objects. We see in the work by Clodion, the great Rococo sculptor. You'll notice that these objects, this is a very small sculpture, and a lot of the paintings that we have seen are also very small, because these are meant for homes. These aren't meant for churches or big palaces, but these are meant for, homes and bedrooms and studies and places like that. So this is domestic art. This is the art of the wealthy and powerful's homes. But this is all going to change, because we're in the next video we're going to learn about a movement called the Enlightenment, and the massive ripples that will turn into waves that will change society as we know it. And this aristocracy who is in power and in control, and the movers and the shakers of this world, are about to lose a whole lot. So stay tuned.